Chapter
I'm James
19.
Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and
Raid
wife
on
writing
the
team that
harbor.
created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine
9
series and the military
October
sci-fi series
1990.
The Rise of the Republic.
As
There's some
Sultan
additional
Qaboos
content we'd like to
Port,
share with you guys today,
Muscat,
and we hope
Oman.
you'll find it informative and entertaining.
Lieutenant Ainsley
We're planning
Fitzgerald
to create
was getting
more
comfortable
videos similar
in
to
her
this
new
in the
role
future.
of container
As
yard
always,
command.
please like,
She and her
share,
platoon
and
sergeant
subscribe.
had a good
Now let's
working
get started.
relationship after being at the As Sultan Qaboos Port for a month. The container yard was organized and flowing smoothly, with tractor-trailer trucks picking up loads in a timely manner and getting them out of the yard. Ships were being unloaded quickly by the stevedores, and her people were marking and accounting for the containers. When a unit rolled in looking for containers, her people were able to take them right to the container and get them loaded and out the door. Life was good. The only flaw in the system was that she had requested a security element be assigned to keep looters out, but all she got was a few unarmed local hires in uniform to walk around the yard at night. Nothing had been stolen yet, but she was still uncomfortable with the arrangement. To rectify the situation, she'd exercised some initiative and had her platoon sergeant develop a guard roster. Needless to say, that did not make the troops happy. Soldiers were pulling 2-hour guard shifts in two two-person teams to include herself and the platoon sergeant. The two teams would conduct roving patrols along the perimeter of the yard with the local security in the interior. Her teams were armed with their M16s, and she required them to wear a helmet and a bulletproof vest that wasn't really bulletproof. It protected you from grenade fragments, not bullets. No one really cared for the vests. They were hot, and they didn't actually stop bullets. Then again, her soldiers were logisticians, not frontline soldiers. Fitzgerald stood in the doorway of the warehouse where her office was located, holding her morning coffee. From that doorway, she could observe most of the yard. She noticed one of the civilian workers along the fence line. What the hell is he doing over there instead of marking the containers? That seems odd. As she watched the worker move away from the fence, her thoughts were interrupted by another file being dropped on her desk, adding to the never-ending mountain of paperwork waiting for her. She was being drowned with all the stuff being sent to her yard, and then trying to make sure it got sorted properly and sent to the right units was a real challenge. She looked at the clock. They had another ship due to arrive that afternoon, and after reviewing the manifest, she knew this load was going to need to be dispersed faster than normal. Ammunition is arriving. A lot of ammunition. Some of the munitions could be left outside in the yard for a short period until it could be delivered, like the artillery shells. But a lot of the other stuff would need to be housed directly inside the warehouse. Seeing her NCOIC walk in, she called out, "Sergeant Murray, I'm going out to the warehouse to look at how we may want to stack the incoming ammo load. If you hear anything more about the ship, like any special requirements for the ammo, let me know as it might change the way we store it. I wish we had hardened bunkers for this stuff. Kinda makes me nervous storing this much ammo unprotected," she said as she donned her cap and departed. "Yes, ma'am. I'll call the ASP and ask them to be standing by to come get it this afternoon or tonight," Sergeant Murray replied as she started to walk outside. "Oh, ma'am, don't forget your gas mask and weapon. CENTCOM policy, you know. You make us all carry them. You should too," Murray said with a gotcha smile, to which Fitzgerald responded with a stink-eye look as she picked up her weapon and mask. The ASP, or Ammunition Supply Point, was responsible for getting the ammunition from her warehouse and yard to the core ammunition storage areas. Sergeant Murray had been working on all his contacts and schmoozing abilities to get their two units singing from the same page of music. They were now moving like a well-oiled machine. Walking over to the warehouse, Fitzgerald was pleased with how the yard was laid out. Unit-identified equipment was all stacked together, along with vehicles rather than everything just thrown together. Supply items were grouped by class of supply into 10 separate areas, each identified with the Roman numeral designation for the supply class, with Class 1, 3, and V being the most important to the frontline troops when things got hot, and not from the environment. Class 1 was food, so pallets of meals ready to eat, or MREs, were stacked in one location. Class 3 was petroleum products, in this case limited to canned oil and lubricants, as she didn't have the storage capacity for fuel. She didn't want the Class 3 next to the Class 1 for fear of contamination, so Class 3 was at the opposite side of the warehouse and at the opposite end. Class 5 was ammunition, so pallets of small arms ammo and pyrotechnics were near the Class 1, but the larger ordnance was located in the yard. The quicker it was out of there and transported to the ASP, the happier she'd be. When she was done with her inspection, she walked back to her office on the other side of the yard. What the hell? She thought as she observed the same guy pacing across the yard. This time she stopped and stared at him as he walked. About halfway across the yard, he looked up and noticed he was being watched. He quickly picked up his pace and started looking at his clipboard as he moved out of sight around a container. Unit 999, 2nd Battalion. Muscat, Oman. Captain Malik al-Masih felt a sudden surge of excitement now that it was dark. The darkness was providing them with the opportunity he needed to finalize the plans for what he hoped would be the beginning of many sabotage and hit-and-run attacks to come. His battalion, the 2nd Saudi Arabia Battalion of Unit 999, had finally been given the go order to start their missions against the coalition forces now forming up in Oman. Lying prone on the ridge, Malik looked down at the sprawling supply depot. The main yard looked to be about 200 meters from the American soldiers' barracks, or the building they were using for barracks and administrative functions. The massive warehouse was another 100 meters beyond that building. Malik and his team of 6 had been on the ridge since the local national workers had left at the end of their shift. While the civilian contractors' work had ended, the soldiers assigned to the yard continued theirs, unloading the ammunition ship and sorting it in the yard and warehouse. "Are you sure these measurements are correct?" Malik asked one of his teammates, the soldier that had a day job working in the container yard. "I paced the distance off myself, sir, except for this one. I thought the female officer in charge of the place was watching me, so I had to quicken my pace. If it's not correct, it's only off by a few meters," the lieutenant explained. "It was the distance from the fence to the artillery rounds storage area." "All right then. Call this back to Sergeant Ahmed and give this to him. I want him to lay 4 mortar rounds per tube on the sleeping area. That should give us enough time and cover to get out of the yard and back through the fence before Ahmed shifts fire to the part of the yard with the artillery rounds. I want him to hit that area with another 4 rounds per tube. This should ignite the entire place. Now go, Lieutenant, and make sure he fully understands his orders and the sequence of how this needs to happen," Captain Malik explained. The lieutenant scampered off to the field telephone they had strung from the ridge to the mortar team, not far away. The mortar team was located on the other side of the ridge near a road that would give them a clean getaway to the safe house near the capital. Placing the field phone down, Sergeant Ahmed motioned for his team of 3 soldiers to circle around him. Looking at their faces, he explained, "The lieutenant just called. They've given us the final coordinates for our fire mission." He handed the coordinates for the troop barracks to the soldier who would be responsible for sighting in the mortar tubes. "The first fire mission is for a 4-round spread. We're to pace the rounds we drop by approximately 30 seconds per round. Once these rounds are complete, Jawad will sight both tubes in for the next target. It's supposed to be a yard that contains recently unloaded artillery rounds. Once a total of 2 minutes have elapsed after the end of the first fire mission, we're to drop another 4-round spread on the yard." Sergeant Ahmed then looked at Jawad. "When we finish dropping those rounds, I need you to grab that bucket of water and slowly pour it over the tubes. We need them cooled down a bit before we throw them in the back of the van. The rest of you, make sure we grab everything and throw it in the van. We don't want to leave anything behind if we can avoid it. Now get to it. We have a supply depot to blow up." "Lieutenant, we have a problem," Sergeant Murray said as he walked into the barracks area. Most of the platoon was eating chow, except for the 2 soldiers working the guard mount, and a couple in the yard directing the loads coming off the ship. "Okay, what is it?" Lieutenant Fitzgerald asked, as she looked up from her tea ration meal. Tea rations were served in large metal trays, 25 servings per tray. Cooks weren't typically needed other than someone who could boil water and pull the heated trays of food out of it every 20 minutes. When the trays had been removed from the boiling water, they'd be opened up with a can opener and served. There were 3 kinds of tray for each meal: a meat tray, a starch tray, and a vegetable tray. If you were really lucky, you might even get a dessert tray. It wasn't the most wholesome of meals, but it sure beat the heck out of MREs. A person's bowels could only take so many weeks of living on MREs before most folks developed some sort of problem. Sergeant Murray explained, "The ship is unloading faster than we can keep up with now that the locals have gone home for the day. If we're going to get this done tonight, I'm going to need everyone in the yard and warehouse now, or it'll take us till breakfast before we're done." As he spoke, the soldiers of the platoon nearby heard his comments and collectively groaned. They were tired and just wanted to eat and hit the rack. Standing, Fitzgerald turned to face the platoon. "Okay, you heard the man. If we want to get to bed, we need to finish this job. As my dad used to say, many hands make light work. So grab your weapons and vests and get out to the yard. You all know your positions, so get to and start directing where it all goes. You guys on the forklifts, watch yourselves and keep your headlights on. Everyone be careful of the heavy equipment moving around out there. We don't need someone getting run over." As she spoke, those still eating were shoveling the last mouthfuls of food into their faces. They knew it'd be hours before they could even think about coming back for more food. "Sergeant Murray, I'm going to head over to the warehouse. Why don't you watch the yard? That way we'll have both areas covered and can unscrew things that might happen," Fitzgerald said as she headed out the door with Murray hot on her heels. "Yes, ma'am. Catch you later. Have you got your walkie-talkie with you?" he asked. "Yeah, let's stay on Channel 10, she replied. The military hadn't issued them civilian handheld radios, but Fitzgerald had recognized a need for them and taken the initiative to just purchase them on her own and solve another problem: communicating. While she only had 2 of them, it allowed her and Sergeant Murray to stay in touch with each other while out in the yard. Captain Al-Masih withdrew his wire cutters and snipped the bottom of the chain-link fence. Standing quickly, he snipped the top of the same wire as the bottom and lay back down. The area was well lit, but with containers stacked 4 high, they were providing a nice shadow for his team to move about the area. With the top and bottom cut, he simply pulled hard on the wire and the fence opened wide enough that a Mack truck could go through. His team moved through the hole. Once everyone was through, 2 of his soldiers used some zip ties to rejoin the cut portions of the fence so it looked good as new. This way, if a roving patrol came by, they'd likely not notice that it had been tampered with. This would also allow them to exit the same area quickly once they were ready. Al-Masih looked at his soldiers and motioned for them to get to work. They didn't have much time. They all knew their assignments and took off at a quick trot. Al-Masih and 3 other soldiers moved to the warehouse. Al-Masih and 1 soldier would set the demo charges on the Class 3 and V items stored there. They only needed to place a few charges next to the petroleum products to get that pile going. Once it was, it'd burn nicely. The 2 other soldiers would set charges on the Class 5 munition products in the warehouse. 2 other soldiers moved to the entrance of the port and yard. They were going to neutralize any guard force they found at the location. This would further aid them in their escape. He hoped they'd be able to subdue the guards, but ultimately, if they had to kill a few people on the night shift, then inshallah. Al-Masih checked his watch. He saw they had 1 minute before the mortar rounds would impact the barracks. That would be the signal for everyone to break and run to their respective targets. The impacting mortar rounds would cause enough confusion for his men to complete their sabotage mission. If all went according to plan, they'd thoroughly jack this entire warehouse and yard putting a further kink in the coalition forces' operations. Maybe I'll get a chance to kill some Americans, too. They have no business sticking their nose in the Middle East, he thought, as he stood in the shadows, waiting. A smile crept across his face. He heard the faint sound of a mortar round sailing over his head, barreling through the night sky seconds before it would crash into the barracks building. That was the signal. He took off at a sprint towards his objective, just as his eyes registered the flash of the explosion in the night sky, and his ears picked up the blasts of not just one explosive, but also a second one moments later. By the time he'd sprinted the 50 meters he needed to cover to reach the warehouse, another pair of explosions erupted behind him. Reaching down, he grabbed the door handle and yanked it open. Now he had to get his explosives planted and get out of the area. Lieutenant Fitzgerald was completing her stroll through the warehouse when the first round hit the barracks. She immediately squatted down at the sound of the explosion, not sure of what had just happened. When the second round hit, there was no doubt in her mind what was going on. What she didn't know was what was causing the explosions or what exactly was blowing up. She'd been directing 4 of her soldiers as they used a forklift to help them stack and sort some large crates of ammunition. The soldiers all looked at her for guidance on what to do next. "Get down, grab your rifles and cover the doors," Fitzgerald screamed as she dove behind a pallet of MREs and a stream of small arms tracer fire suddenly appeared. Whoever was shooting at them had sent a torrent of bullets and tracer fire down the center aisle of the warehouse, attempting to pin them down. 2 of her soldiers froze, unsure of what to do, or maybe they just hadn't heard her instructions. Suddenly, one of them spun around and stumbled. It looked like he'd been shot. The other soldier finally dove to the side for cover. Fitzgerald pulled her M16 to her shoulder. It suddenly dawned on her that her little fiefdom was under attack. She had intruders inside the wire. They were inside the warehouse, and they'd just shot one of her soldiers. Looking above the stack of MREs she'd hidden behind, she saw 4 figures run through the large warehouse doors. She brought her rifle to bear on them, placing her sight picture on one of them as they started to split up, presumably to carry out their mission. Flicking the safety off her rifle, she squeezed the trigger just like she'd been taught to do. The figure she'd fired at clutched at his chest and stumbled for a brief moment before collapsing to the ground. Her Tennessee mom, who'd taught her how to shoot, would have been proud. The other figures dropped behind pallets, looking for cover as she started firing at them next. Her 2 remaining soldiers were exercising the shooting technique of spray and pray, firing wildly and randomly all over the place. "Damn it, Fowley and Sprigg. Take a breath and try to aim before you fire. They're over there, behind the Class 5 pallets." "I need to get some help in here now," she thought when she heard the sound of something hard hitting the floor near them. "Grenade," was all she had time to say before it detonated, sending shrapnel across the room. Fowley and Sprigg said nothing, but she could see that they weren't moving. The grenade looked to have landed between them. As if on cue, a figure jumped up and began moving down the center aisle, shooting at Fowley and Spriggs's position. Fitzgerald didn't flinch or hesitate. She brought her rifle up and fired several shots into the attacker's chest. The Iraqi went down with a scream and thrashed about on the floor, blood rapidly pooling around him. 2 down, 2 to go. Just then, Sergeant Murray ran through the open doorway to see what the hell was going on. "Lieutenant, are you okay?" Before she could answer, red tracers whipped around him as a handful of bullets tore into his chest. Murray's body was flung backwards from the force of the bullets. "No!" She heard herself shouting at what was happening around her. One of her soldiers was wounded, 2 more had been killed, and now her NCOIC was dead. She couldn't see where Murray's executioner had fired from. All she knew was she had to move before she got flanked. Getting to her feet, she sprinted to the other side of the warehouse and ducked behind a stack of pallets in the Class 3 area, hoping she hadn't been spotted. Looking back at her old position, she watched a burst of automatic weapons fire tear into it. They'd figured out where she was, and they had worked to flank her. She let out a loud moan and almost cried from the emotional shock of what was happening around her. "Pull it together, Ainsley. You got this," she muttered softly as she reapplied her metaphorical war paint. She was going to kill these bastards. Then she heard someone moving cautiously but quickly down the warehouse, right towards her. He stopped and knelt down on the opposite side of the pallets she hid behind. Looking between the pallets, she saw him squatting right in front of her, looking down. "Son of a bitch," she thought. "Is he placing a charge on my pallets?" She raised her weapon slowly until it was pointed right at him. Then he looked up and right into her eyes. It was the last thing he saw before she pulled the trigger and his head exploded. Seconds after she fired her single shot, she heard more shooting at the entrance next to the Class V section, as some of the other platoon members had now converged on the warehouse. The last remaining attacker was dead. "Don't shoot! I'm coming out!" Fitzgerald yelled. "The last thing I need to do is get shot by my own soldiers." "Lieutenant, are you okay?" one of them called out as he ran up to her. "Yeah, but how is Sergeant Murray?" she called out as she walked around the dead attackers. She assumed they were likely Iraqi soldiers, though they weren't wearing any uniforms. Who else could they be? "He's dead, ma'am," was the response. Sighing, she nodded at the news. "Okay, this last guy looked to be setting some demo charges. I want you guys to start searching the warehouse for any of them. If you find them, let's grab them and move them to the far side of the yard, away from everything." She pointed down to the charge her attacker was planting. "These are clearly some sort of plastic explosives, so they aren't going to detonate if you touch them or move them. Just get them out of the warehouse if you find any, got it?" "Yes, ma'am," came a chorus of calls from a few of the soldiers, who set about looking for more charges. Moments later, Lieutenant Fitzgerald found herself alone. She walked around the pallets to the man she'd shot. She'd never seen a dead person before, and certainly not one that she had killed. As she stood there looking down, she began to feel queasy. She noticed the top of the Iraqi's head was missing. That was when she regurgitated her dinner. Her legs became weak, and she braced herself on the pallet, thankful that she was alone, and no one was there to see this display of weakness. After a few minutes of deep breaths and a drink of warm water from her canteen, she felt that she could resume her duties. She began to prioritize what needed to be done, knowing she would be taking on more responsibility until she could get a replacement for Sergeant Murray. Walking out of the warehouse, she saw the building they had been living and working out of on fire in a couple of places. The building was wrecked. Nearly all the windows had been blown out, and a couple of fires were slowly smoldering away. It was a real mess. Walking out of the building were some soldiers, clearly helping some wounded. Seeing the wounded, she made her way towards them. Someone had gathered the wounded and placed them in one location. A couple of her combat medics were doing their best to treat the wounded. A few soldiers continued to move in and out of the building, either carrying or helping a wounded person out or bringing a dead body out. Seeing what had happened to her people almost made her want to retch again. As she moved towards them, she ran into Staff Sergeant Robinson. He was the 3rd squad leader and the highest-ranking soldier after Sergeant Murray. He was also a damn good NCO himself. "Staff Sergeant, how you doing?" she asked, still feeling a little weak. "Good, ma'am. How about you?" he replied, concern in his voice. "I think I'll be all right. Right now I need you to take Sergeant Murray's place. Once we're sure the area is cleared of any other attackers, let's focus on making sure we find and collect our wounded." As she was talking, the sound of police and fire engine sirens grew in intensity. Help was finally on the way. Hopefully her wounded could get treated at one of the local hospitals and get the treatment they needed. "Sergeant, take over for the moment. I'm going to call headquarters and let them know we've been attacked and taken casualties," she finally said before walking away. Chapter 20. The western sky lights up. 10th of October, 1990. Yanbu, Saudi Arabia. Red Sea. Captain Abir al-Malouf slowly broke the surface of the dark waters of the Red Sea, made so by the moonless night. It had been a long swim from where the small, nondescript fishing boat had dropped him and his team into the water. They still had 300 yards to go to reach the tanker ship docked at one of the petroleum docks in Yanbu. The SS American Trader was a T-2 tanker left over from World War II and still supplying oil products to the American fleet. This was to be her last trip before going to India to be scrapped. Her 30-man crew of mostly foreign seamen would deliver the ship to India, and then the company, C.F. Sharp Shipping, would fly them to their home port of Okinawa to sign them off. All were anxious to get back to another ship, as the extra pay for being in a declared combat zone was well worth the time they spent. Besides, Iraq had no navy, and the U.S. air cover precluded an airstrike against them. Yanbu, with its excellent seaport and 3 oil refineries, was a strategic port. It was the best seaport in Saudi Arabia on the Red Sea, even better than Jeddah. The airport had just received the first of the American forces with the 101st Airborne Division arriving that morning. Planes were landing about 1 every hour, and already a full infantry brigade was on the ground. The follow-on support elements were beginning to arrive along with more attack helicopters from the 2nd of the 17th Cav Squadron and the 3rd Battalion, Attack, 101st Aviation Brigade. The 1st Battalion, Attack, 101st Aviation Brigade, had already drawn blood in the Battle of Medina Ridge and was in the process of moving to Yanbu to join the rest of the division. As Captain al-Malouf observed the ship, he noted that no security guards were visible on the deck. He also didn't see any patrol boats moving around the harbor. To the north, there were other tankers at the loading docks, but that was another mile swim. The currents had moved his team south of where they should have been. This single ship, however, was within range, and that sealed his decision. He motioned to his teammates, and they slowly sank below the surface and activated their electric miniature sleds on a due east compass heading, staying 20 feet below the surface. As they progressed eastward, they noticed visibility increasing due to the lighting along the dock. The water was crystal clear to begin with. Al-Malouf made the decision to drop down to 30 feet as he and his team approached the ship. He slowed his approach as the hull of the ship became visible, with one 2-man team heading for the bow and him and his teammate heading for the stern. Being an older tanker, the SS American Trader didn't have a double hull like modern tankers had. The double hull prevented an oil spill if the ship ran aground. As al-Malouf reached the stern of the ship, he followed the propeller shaft back into the hull. The thinnest metal on a ship is located in the stern around the propeller shaft. A limpet mine attached at this point would open a larger hole, and even if the ship could be saved, it wouldn't be going anywhere with a damaged propeller shaft. He knew that the ship would sink from their mines, and that would foul up the harbor for subsequent freighters. What he wanted was a spectacular explosion that would rip the entire dock and port area apart. The forward team went deep under the ship and came up to place 2 mines, one on each side of the ship just below the waterline. This would open the side where the fuel holding tanks were located. When the charges detonated, the fuel vapors would ignite and create a huge fireball, engulfing the ship and possibly destroying the docks. Private Hayes was a member of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment. He had been on the first plane landing early that week and was dog-ass tired. The heat was sapping his strength as well. Sure, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, was hot and muggy in the summer, but this dry heat was something else. It was like walking around with your sister's hairdryer blowing in your face. Normally, his fatigues would be soaking wet with perspiration in the heat. The desert fatigues were made of heavy canvas and designed to cause one to perspire. The dry air would cause evaporation to occur quickly, and thus keep the body cool, or so the design engineers had explained. Private Hayes doubted that the engineers ever came to the Middle East, however. About every 30 minutes, someone was handing him a liter bottle of water to drink, and yet he noticed when he urinated, it still wasn't clear. It was on the darker side, indicating his body was becoming dehydrated. As he walked his one-man guard post along the dock in the Yanbu port, his mind wandered. "What the hell are we doing guarding a dock, and why are we so dispersed?" he said to himself, since no one else was around. He went over what they had been told earlier. Sergeant Williams, their platoon sergeant, had told the guards to stay in sight of each other, but not to buddy up as they walked their posts. Their sergeant had even gone so far as to use spray paint to designate the start and end of each of their posts, so they knew exactly where it was. The soldiers were all disappointed that they weren't being allowed to have a buddy on duty with them. Patrolling something like this on your own was incredibly boring. You spent hours upon hours alone, unable to talk with anyone to help pass the time, as you just paced between the two spray-painted points. I wonder what my flyboy Air Force brother is doing right now. Can't believe he really joined the Air Force to be a boom operator on those tankers. Talk about a soft job. He probably would have washed out of the infantry. His brother was a bit of a book nerd and soft. As he continued to walk his post, he glanced up at the night sky. Although the lights of the dock and refinery diminished the intensity of the night sky, the Milky Way was clearly visible. "When I get off tonight, I need to sit down and write Billy Sue a letter. I know she must be worried about me. Oh, it would be so nice to be with her tonight in the forward cabin of her dad's sailboat. I never realized what you could do in that small cabin riding on anchor until she showed me," he reminisced, as his mind began to wander again. He smiled at the last time they'd gone to the movies together. It was a double feature, with Bird on a Wire, starring Mel Gibson and Goldie Hawn, and the much-anticipated release of Back to the Future Part 3. They'd laughed pretty hard during the first show before having a little fun of their own, her sitting on his lap, her breasts pressed against his face. I wonder where she learned those moves. I'd like to have her on my lap right now. Oh, the way she ground down on me. Damn, I'm getting a hard-on right now. Grunting to himself, he was glad he was alone right now. He'd never hear the end of it from his platoon mates. Getting a hard-on while on duty wasn't exactly standard operating procedure. 20 feet below the surface of the water, Sergeant Asif Abd al-Rashid started easing towards the surface. He and Sergeant Danish Abbas were responsible for setting the limpet mine on the dock side of the ship. This would help ensure the ship essentially sunk right alongside the dock, making the dock useless until they were able to refloat the wreckage and move it, effectively rendering one of the critically important pieces of the port inaccessible. Coming out from under the keel of the ship, Sergeant Asif noticed the clarity of the water right away. The lighted docks illuminated the area, and the water next to the ship so clearly he could even see the brightly painted large and bold letters that said, "No smoking." He was still 20 feet from the surface. Slowly, Asif and Abbas moved up the side of the ship as they wanted to place their mines just below the surface. Once they were attached, they would set the timer and then get out of there as quickly as possible. This job required 2 mines, which was why each of the divers carried one. They weren't leaving anything to chance. Their orders were to make this harbor as impossible to use as they could. Still, Asif was a bit conflicted about the placement of the mines. They'd been taught that the best place for anti-ship mines was along the keel of the ship, where they would break the primary strength and support structure of the ship, causing it to sink. But if a large explosion was the desired effect, then the mines should be placed above the waterline, where the fire and explosion would have sufficient oxygen to ignite the fumes of the JP-8 aviation fuel the tankers were taking on. Sergeant Asif was concerned about the sudden inflow of water suppressing the flames and inhibiting the fuel fumes from igniting. When he'd brought this concern up the captain, he had been told in no uncertain terms to stop questioning the advice of his superiors and just execute the orders given to him. That kind of attitude bred a lot of distrust between the officers and the senior sergeants. As Sergeant Asif and his fellow diver rose toward the surface, he smiled, knowing that the captain wasn't around to micromanage them. His divers would plant the mines the correct way, a couple of feet above the waterline, not below. We just need a few minutes and the mines will be ready. Now that the sun was starting to set, the heat wasn't as bad. Still, drinking a liter of water every hour was beginning to place a strain on Hayes's bladder. Damn, I haven't pissed this much since that night drinking at Cat West back in Clarksville. It'd almost be easier to just leave my dick hanging out so I can piss when I feel the urge, he thought to himself as he laughed at the image of that. Walking up to the edge of the dock to relieve himself, he unbuttoned his trousers' front section and whipped his penis out. Just as he was about to start peeing, he saw something that caused him to pause. What the hell? Is there some sort of big fish near the tanker? That's an awful lot of bubbles. It's almost like there might be some sort of diver under there. Oh shit! Hayes yelled loudly in surprise just as a head cleared the surface of the water. In that moment, his training took over as he yanked his M16 from his shoulder. When he yelled, the diver in the water seemed startled and looked around for the source of the noise. In all his frantic searching, he never looked up. With his rifle now in his hands, Hayes flicked the safety off his M16 as he pointed down at the diver. Then the man in the water peered up through the water and their eyes connected. There was an expression of surprise on his face, but then he pulled something metallic out of the water. In the blink of an eye, Hayes's finger had moved from the foregrip of the trigger guard to the trigger as he started firing. He saw his first 3-round burst of fire land near the diver, but it missed. He readjusted faster than he'd thought was possible, placing his sight picture right on the face of the diver, who at this point had raised some sort of pistol of his own right back at Hayes. Pop, pop, pop! The 3-round burst of his M16 thudded right into the diver, who instinctively fired his own pistol twice, sending a couple of bullets sailing right next to Hayes's head, causing him to flinch. Hayes continued to fire 3-round bursts at the diver, whose body now appeared to be lifeless, steadily sinking deeper into the water. He didn't care, though. The bastard had nearly killed him, and for all he knew there were more divers down there, so he kept pumping rounds into the water. At this point, several soldiers from Hayes's platoon came running towards him, their rifles in their hands, ready to join him if needed. Corporal Johansson shouted to Hayes as he dropped his spent magazine to the ground and was in the process of slapping a fresh one in its place. "What the hell are you shooting at, dumbass?" As the 2 soldiers came right up to him, panting from being out of breath. Hayes pointed to the water below. "Right there. There was a diver right down there. I pumped at least 3 rounds into his chest before he fired 2 rounds at me." "Whoa, you're saying you actually saw a diver down there?" Specialist Barry said. A little further away, at the entrance to the pier, was a vehicle racing down towards them. "Oh, great. Here comes Sergeant Billings. You better be right, Hayes, or Billings is going to have your ass for emptying a magazine into the water like that," Corporal Johansson added. Crinkling his eyebrows in frustration, Hayes shot back, "I know what I saw." Just then, the vehicle racing towards them came to a halt. Staff Sergeant Billings stepped out and marched right towards Hayes, with a look on his face that said this had better be good. Staff Sergeant Billings was a large black man that took good care of his men, but he didn't tolerate misbehavior or slacking. He ran a tight team, keeping them out of trouble and always being the first to finish a task assigned to them. Approaching the 3, he demanded, "Okay, someone explain to me why I heard gunfire a few minutes ago." Johansson and Barry slowly stepped back from Hayes, making it obvious who was the guilty party. "Hayes, you have a story for me," Billings said, not really asking. "Sergeant Billings, I was getting ready to take a piss over the side of the dock, and as I looked down into the water, I saw these bubbles coming up. Next thing I know, some diver's head pops up and I yelled. The guy looked around, but he hadn't looked up yet. I managed to unsling my rifle and aimed it at him. I was about to tell him to surrender when I saw him bringing something metallic out of the water. At that point, I fired a 3-round burst at him, but missed. Then he fired twice at me before I hit him with another burst. That's when I decided to keep shooting around him, in case another diver was still down there. I think someone may be doing something with the boats tied up here, Hayes explained. Did anyone else see this guy? Billings asked, looking at Johansson and Barry. No, Sarge, Johansson said, though he was now looking down into the water and along the side of the ship. I was down that way, so I didn't see anything, Barry said, pointing to where his guard position was. Billings walked over to the edge of the dock and peered into the dark waters. As he looked down into the water, he couldn't see much. The sun was nearly gone, which meant they were relying more on the lights along the pier. Then he spotted something. A single bubble broke the surface. With a puzzled look on his face, he kept staring at the location the bubble had just come from. Then he saw a small cluster of bubbles break the surface. Now he believed something was amiss. He just didn't know what. Say, turning his head slightly while still keeping his eyes on the water, he called out, Corporal Johansson, get on the radio and call the head shed. Tell them we may have enemy divers near the pier and this ship. Tell them one of our guards believes he shot and killed one of them. We need a diver down here right now to investigate this out further. Private Barry, get your ass up on the ship and find a ship's officer right now. Yes, Sergeant, came the quick reply from Barry as he took off at a run to the gangplank leading to the ship. Several sailors were along the rail now, watching the activity on the dock below them. They'd heard the shooting, and when they saw Barry take off, it didn't take much for them to realize what was going on. Almost immediately, as one, they started running for the gangplank. They wanted off the ship now. Billings looked over at Hayes. Okay, I believe you, Hayes. You done good, he said, a determined look on his face. Thank you, Sergeant, was all Hayes managed to say. The reality of just having shot and likely killed someone was starting to set in. Johansson came up. Sergeant, the head shed wanted to know what's going on, and I told them. They said for all of us to get off this dock, but secure the road approaching it. Okay, you round up Barry and Hayes here and get moving. I'll follow along in the vehicle and pick you up, but I want you away from here. Now move it, troop. Hayes and Johansson didn't have to be told twice. As Barry and a ship's officer approached, Barry noticed his two compadres running down the dock. Billings just looked at him and pointed towards the others. Barry took off after them. I first mate on ship. What matter? The officer asked. It was clear English was not his first language. Sir, I believe we killed a diver who was attempting to put a limpet mine on your ship. I would recommend you get your crew off until we can get some divers to check out the ship, Billings said. I finish load jet fuel, then go. Billings shook his head. Sir, I have asked that divers be sent down to look at your ship. It would be safer if you waited just to make sure everything is okay. I have schedule. Diver come before I go, okay, the office said, and in his native tongue relayed something to the crew that had disembarked. Reluctantly, the crew climbed back aboard and returned to their duties. Billings shrugged his shoulders and got back in his vehicle. Driving down the dock towards the mainland, he picked up the 3 exhausted soldiers. They'd driven down the dock towards the shore for only a few minutes when a bright flash erupted behind them. Then a massive blast wave slammed into the rear of their vehicle, shoving it forward like a child's toy. Billings fought like hell to keep the vehicle from flipping over or rolling. The heat from the blast had been so intense, it singed the exposed hairs on their skin. Next came the ringing in the ears, which would make communicating that much harder until their hearing returned back to somewhat normal again. Steering the vehicle to a safe spot to stop, Billings put the vehicle in park. As he got out, he saw the run-flat tires on the vehicle had been shredded. The vehicle's paint had been burned right off. Hell, he looked down at his arms and could see singed hair on them. Turning, he looked back at the ship. There was nothing left save for a few large chunks of the hull, rapidly sinking next to the dock. Everything was ablaze. The oil pipelines that fed out to the ship were spewing flames as more fuel continued to pump out of them. Someone would get that shut off shortly. Turning to look at his guys, he saw they were a little shook up, but aside from some minor cuts and burns, and the fact that hardly any of them could hear anything, they all seemed to be all right. Billings walked up to Private Hayes and put a hand on his shoulder. "You probably just saved all our lives, Hayes," he shouted. "I'm putting you in for a medal, son. Damn proud of you." Hayes just gave a goofy smile and pointed to his ears. Billings just smiled. They'd just dodged death by the slimmest of margins. They'd get their hearing back, but they wouldn't have gotten their lives back if Hayes hadn't spotted that enemy diver. Still, he felt bad that the captain of the ship hadn't heeded their warning. Not that it mattered. They likely wouldn't have gotten far enough away from the ship when it blew.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.